Hi, Steve here. It's Friday, November 7th, 2025. This video today, I'm going to talk about a problem that I think we have in the church. Not exclusively, but especially the Catholic Church. And that is that we don't care about the truth. Okay, so I'll start with a little prayer here from Scripture. God, I give thanks to you because I am not like other men. Amen. Okay, so that was from Luke 18. Now, this last Sunday in his homily, my pastor, Reverend Newtown, let's call him, as is his custom, reiterated a claim he had made the previous Sunday, not to mention other Sundays before that. Remember what we said last Sunday? Father said. Oh, I remember, Father. So the truth is, we didn't say anything, but what Reverend Newtown had said, and then the next Sunday repeated, was essentially, what you do is your concern, what others do is their concern. So pay no attention to what others do, it has nothing to do with you. That was the moral sense, so to speak, that Reverend Newtown had pulled out of that Sunday's gospel reading, Jesus' parable of the Pharisee and the publican, found in Luke chapter 18. Now, if Father's mind your own business moral reading of the gospel were correct, I guess it would imply that my obligation would be to act accordingly, right? But meaning what exactly? Well, if, for example, I happened to think that his claim was, say, an absurd and fundamentally anti-Christian one, my obligation would be, I guess, to just stifle that thought, because supposedly his claim is his to make, right? His concern, his business, and according to Father, it has nothing to do with me. It's not of my concern, none of my business. And I guess that's it, just how it is. At least how it would be if Father's claim were true, right? However, notwithstanding that I could be wrong, I am quite certain that Father's claim is not true. I'm quite certain that it's absurdly self-contradictory. It's hopelessly hypocritical. It's fundamentally anti-Christian, so far as I can understand it. So that leaves me with a problem. What to do about it? Should I point out my problem to Newtown? Well, if he believes his own preaching, does he? I don't know. But if he does, I have reason to be concerned that he might just respond by invoking his own principle, which is to say, he might respond by dismissing my objection, since I'm making his actions my concern, and according to him, his actions are his concern, no concern of mine. As far as I can see, however, such a response would obviously be unreasonable on his part, purely begging the question and contradicting himself, since when he tells me that my actions are my concern and that his actions are not my concern, it seems he is, in that very act of telling me this, he's taking my actions as his concern. Action. As far as I can see, however, such a response would obviously be unreasonable on his part, purely begging the question and contradicting himself. Since when he tells me that my actions are my concern and that his actions are not my concern, it seems he is, in that very act of telling me this, taking my actions as his concern. So that would make him a hypocrite by his own principle. And when he speaks to me with a quite reasonable expectation that I will listen to what he says, he is making his actions my concern. The alternative would be that he means for me to ignore him, which doesn't seem plausible. So his claim, his moral teaching, it appears, is indeed just hypocritical and self-contradicting. But maybe he wouldn't respond that way. That is, by telling me, in accordance with his own mixed-up principle, that his actions, that is, his teaching, is none of my concern. Maybe, in truth, even he himself doesn't really believe his own teaching in this case. After all, he is a Catholic priest, right? So isn't it safe to assume that he is fundamentally a good person, right? That he doesn't just preach the importance of humility, but practices it. And that even if he has a habit of saying things that obviously are not true, still fundamentally he probably still cares about the truth. maybe he just has an unfortunate habit of misspeaking more or less frequently. Well, as the Muslims say, God knows best. But I think this is an important issue to talk about, because I think a more troubling alternative is also possible. I think it's possible that Father really might not care about the truth. And it's not just him. I think not caring about the truth is actually a major problem, endemic in the church, among both clergy and laity. So why would I think that? I could recite any number of personal anecdotes to illustrate my concern, but I'll mention just a couple more here, which I hope will serve to contextualize and justify my concern. So the first incident happened maybe 10 years ago. My wife had gone to a retreat led by a Dominican priest. After the retreat, she told me that the priest had explained that there's a difference between, on the one hand, the truth, and on the other hand, what you believe is the truth. And that the actual truth matters, not just whatever you happen to believe is the truth. Because the truth is the truth, but your belief might be either true or false. Duh, right? Well, for my wife, this point struck her as a kind of revelation. She told me it had suddenly clicked for her why it was that, in her words, I was so obsessed with the truth. Because the actual truth actually matters, not just whatever I say or say I believe is the truth. The actual truth also matters. Obviously, right? Maybe, but I think most of the time people fail to actually acknowledge in their actual conduct of life, their actual conversation, any conceptual distinction between the actual truth and whatever it is they say or believe to be true. To be fair, practically speaking, it does make perfect sense, and it's really inevitable that I treat what I take to be the truth, what I believe to be true, as the truth, the actual truth. That's kind of just what it means to actually believe something. But nonetheless, if I indeed care about the actual truth, I still need to remember that what I believe is true might not be, and that the actual truth does not just become irrelevant to me in the case where I have failed to recognize it, and where what I believe may actually be false. Right? The second personal anecdote I'll mention is an encounter I had with a priest after a mass on Christmas Day a few years ago. It was my first conversation with Father Lucci, and he made a claim which I thought was not true. So I told him, I don't think that's true. As I recall, we had a rather short continuation of the conversation after that, before he had enough of it. And he told me flat out to my face, I don't care about the truth. Well, Merry Christmas to you too, Father. I knew Father Lucci well enough at that point, that is, I'd heard enough of his preaching to be unsurprised that he didn't care about the truth. But I was shocked that anyone would so shamelessly, openly declare that he didn't care about the truth, especially a priest who had just finished saying Mass. What extraordinarily honest dishonesty. But what I can't help wondering, looking back on that conversation, is whether this priest was really less honest than other priests who would never say such a thing, or more honest. Maybe the others also don't care about the truth, but they're not honestly dishonest enough to come right out and say it. I'll mention the well-known term silent apostasy here as something that perhaps should be a grave concern to us. But perhaps we could also say our trouble in the church is more precisely an apostasy of just sinking into comfortable, lukewarm indifference, and especially indifference precisely to the truth. In any case, getting back to Reverend Newtown's problematic preaching on the gospel, does all this actually have anything to do with the proud Pharisee and the humble publican? Besides claiming that the lesson is to mind your own business, Reverend Newtown also correctly pointed out that spiritual pride is not good. So, right. But now, what we need to think about and explain is, what is spiritual pride, and how do we avoid it? Thomas Aquinas, if I recall correctly, teaches that pride is the most difficult sin to eradicate, because it is precisely if and when we make real progress in goodness and in overcoming evil that the occasion where the temptation to pride arises. So this means that the humble publican, were he to hear Jesus' teaching that he went away from his praying more justified than the proud Pharisee, the humble publican could then easily slide into his own temptation to become proud, rather like the Pharisee. Thank God I'm righteously humble, not like that sinful proud Pharisee. I just mind my own business. I don't pay any attention to what anyone else does. Unlike that Pharisee jerk who's always judging people and thinking he's better than others. At least I'm much better than him. Thanks be to God. Right? So I would suggest to Reverend Newtown that the lesson that pride is not good is too obvious, right? And not helpful. What we really need to recognize is that pride is difficult to avoid, because precisely in becoming more good, more virtuous, which we are certainly called to do, we can be, and almost certainly will be, at the same time tempted to pride. And we certainly can't avoid pride by donning a mask of false humility, where we pretend to just mind our own business and not be concerned about what anyone else is doing, so that we can count ourselves more righteously humble than all the proud busybodies who we suppose aren't nearly as humble as we are. Instead of jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, from thank God I'm not like that publican to thank God I'm not like that Pharisee, it should be obvious that there are other options. Right? Neither spiritual pride nor false humility constitutes actual Christian virtue, which most centrally requires charity, loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself, which seems to me is not compatible with humbling yourself before God, whatever that really means, to the point where you pay no attention to what your neighbor does. Jesus obviously did not say, if your brother sins against you, pay no attention to him. He says, go and correct him. But why would Reverend Newtown preach such a strange message in the first place? What could possibly possess him? I certainly don't claim to know, but I do wonder if there could be a connection to what I mentioned before. Possibly he really doesn't care about the truth. And so by teaching his flock that they should just mind their own business, perhaps he means to teach them that if they have concerns, questions, objections regarding the truthfulness of his own preaching, then they are kindly requested to mind their own business. Don't judge me, and don't judge what I say on behalf of the church and the Christian faith. Mind your own business. Attend to your own sins. Now that's just a suspicion I have about what might motivate the pastor's false teaching in this case. But regardless, so far as I can see, this teaching in itself, besides being crudely hypocritical, is effectively a teaching of contempt for the truth. And it seems to me that true Christian humility would be quite opposed to what Reverend Newtown teaches. True Christian humility would not say, mind your own business. It would say, I am a sinner before God and man. If I say or do something wrong, please correct me and forgive me. And I will do the same for you if I think you've said or done something wrong. Not obviously nitpicking every little thing, but in accordance with the demands of the two great commandments, to love and thus obey God, and to love and thus make it my business to seek the good of my neighbor. I also think the false humility of Reverend Newtown's mind your own business version of the fundamental ethos of Christian life in common, and the true Christian humility which requires fraternal correction and forgiveness, represent two competing versions of what we could call our being on the way together as Christians. That is to say, two different versions of what has been promoted in the church in recent years under the term synodality. So a few remarks on synodality. I think it's important to realize, first of all, that synodality, construed as our being on the way together, can't be either good or evil in itself. Quite obviously, depending on the details, it can be a blessing or a curse. False synodality, represented by the authoritarian Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, just do what I tell you, is a curse. It's an authoritarian, anti-intellectual contempt for truth, which presumptuously insists that we are all on the way together in virtue of, simply in accordance with the dictates of authoritarian convenience, paying no attention to what those others are doing, especially the men behind the curtain, or the men wearing special hats or sacred vestments. So I submit, true synodality entails precisely an obligation of mutual regard and respect, literally meaning we actually must look at each other, as opposed to disregarding or despising, literally meaning looking away from each other, paying no attention to each other. And it entails respectful conversation. Literally, we not only look upon each other, but we go back and forth with each other. We give and receive from one another, as opposed to shutting ourselves off from one another, pretending that my actions are mine and yours are yours, and mine have nothing to do with yours, and yours have nothing to do with mine. That, I'm afraid, just seems like diabolical nonsense. But further in this synodality connection, a note on Reverend Newtown's quaint expression, "Remember what we said last week?" Well, no, as I already pointed out, it was him and him alone who said what he said, not us. But then again, I guess none of us registered any objection to what he said. So perhaps it's only natural that he feels justified in assuming we're all on the same page. We're all happily accompanying him down the yellow brick road to the wonderful wherever it is we imagine we're all going towards. So maybe in reality, the failure is ours as much as his, because we actually have failed to synodally accompany him, that is, with the authentic Christian witness, the Christian conversation, perhaps even the Christian spiritual work of mercy, of fraternal correction, of which he just might be in need. Certainly the fault in this regard may be partly his. Perhaps he has failed to invite and foster any such ethos of authentic Christian synodal accompaniment. But it seems unlikely that the fault is all on his side. Now, I don't know how this act of authentic Christian accompaniment, this video of mine, will be received by Reverend Newtown. A few years ago at a different parish in another town, I tried to open a conversation on the issue of liturgical abuse in the parish. The immediate consequence of that was that Linda, the then reigning RCIA boss lady, summarily dismissed me from volunteering with the RCIA team. And Father D, the pastor, seconded his loyal henchwoman's summary action against me and politely suggested I take myself and my family and go find some other, less inclusive parish to be a part of. Because his parish, in his mind, was too inclusive to include someone like me. Ouch. So I certainly don't presume that every priest is equally autocratic and dishonest, petty, proud, defensive, closed-minded, hypocritical, etc. But I'm not so naive at this point that I'm not more or less prepared to encounter such traits in the behavior of priests and other such authority figures. And for what it's worth, the final point in regard to the Pharisee and the publican, I'll just point out that we technically don't have Pharisees anymore. But a lot of priests might do well to consider that we do have their successors. And if you're looking for who that might be, you may not have far to look.